Jó napot kívánok!
Greetings to all. I'm Geza Tenyi. May I also introduce my colleague? I came as a lawyer to this conference as an expert in legal matters, and it is about cloud computing, the legal aspects of cloud computing, confidential information uh, handling of about which I would like to say a few words to you. So before entering the details of the legal elements, I would like to say a few words about a book that is probably well known to part of the participants. Made a major impact on me, and it changed my attitude to law. It's Lawrence Lessing's The Codeless Law, uh, which was the second edition was published in 2006, and that interprets what he calls cyberspace, this virtual world, and its control, its operations, and the computer controls and commands that are behind, comparing it to legal commands in the apparent world, in the real world. So we can compare these two life settings, like spheres, which are there, where our life and the economy is taking place and performing. And in this comparison, he also concludes that a legal provision, as it is invented by man, its interpreting can also take various forms and can give rise to various disputes and arguments. Then an information, on the other hand, an information system which is working and controlled by codes cannot repeat or produce the same problems of operation, which is a very interesting question from a legal point of view. If we look at this standpoint, namely that what are the set of norms regulating our lives, and then we can see that these different systems of standards, of norms in the cyberspace by interpreting these codes, they interrelate, uh, and which is either interrelated on an equal footing or one subordinated to the other. And at least from a lawyer's point of view, to consider that one IT environment gives what kind of opportunity for action can be much more limited than in a legal framework where, of course, you have a much larger space for interpretation and application. And so that is, if we compare the legal settings and the application of the codes. Now, of course, as I just mentioned, these systems are interrelated, having an impact on each other. And of course, even the legislator has to be aware of some technical information concerning IT, then should consider these as a higher code in creating all these systems. There can be some prohibitions there included in various forms, but also some incentives, incentive rules combined with prohibitions that will somehow favor some kind of a conduct to be followed. Now, if we consider this way of thinking, which is reflected in this publication, if we now apply that to cloud computing, then a basic question for a legal expert, for a lawyer, that whether the code system, the command system embedded in that IT system that is available in cloud computing, what kind of legal opinion should be based on that? How can it be conformed to that set of codes that we learned in our studies? Now, this question is coming up in various aspects because we very well know those phenomena are not covered by the legal instruments, then of course such legal instruments like, for example, contracts or other instructions that will have to be used and which are much closer, which will bring the legal system, legal regulation closer to the existing IT world. Now, it was, of course, a very abstract consideration that I just mentioned. If we consider a lawyer cabinet as a production unit with all the inputs and outputs, we can conclude that there is, of course, an overall data processing element that, of course, in each of the lawyer cabinets, we are dealing with confidential business, confidential data, which are classified data. And for this reason, of course, the major obligation is the obligation of secrecy. And this will have to be respected in all of the analogous and electronic and informatic systems that we have. And of course, we are obliged to record, maintain data. This is a high degree of responsibility towards our clients. I would also come to talk about that at a later stage. On the other hand, it is also our chamber of lawyers also gives such regulations and recommendations to us when it comes to IT security, and this activity in the chamber of lawyers in Budapest has become a major concern, trying to push to convince lawyers to take this more and more into consideration. But some of the lawyers, of course, short of sufficient knowledge, are only dragging behind to cope with this. And this is also somehow part of the curve of development of our own cabinet, that there is a lawyer cabinet started with 2 lawyers, and then we see, yes, that financially this is worthwhile, it's viable, it starts on a growing edge. Path, and then we can also employ some new colleagues to work with us. Then after a while, what we see that as our clients represent quite a wide range as to individuals or geographical coverage. So then our own tools should be mobile tools to be able to cover all these. Then also there is the other phenomena, namely that the colleagues who already have acquired some experiences, they will bring their own appliances. Of course, together to go with our lawyer diploma, we do not have any additional element in that area. So we are faced with the fact that we have to integrate a tool, device in our work that we do not know the exact details, the rules by which they have to be used. And it is only by and when we reach a certain level, we are about 4 to 6 staff in the cabinet. Then we should have our own IT network inside with some access authorization. As I say, there is a curve of expansion for a successful legal office, legal cabinet, and this profession forced us in 2010 to make a decision, either to make us an investment to buy a server and install one, or at that time it was a cloud computing service which was just about to be present at that time that we could opt for.
Itt nagyon lényeges az, hogy akkor, amikor ez az igény felmerült, a számunkra sokkal inkább a munkafolyamati ellenőrzés, a munkafolyamati hatékonyság lebegett a szemünk előtt. Az adatvédelem is megjelent, mint szempont, de ez nem az elsőrendű szempontok között. Ez ugyanakkor magának a konkrét modellnek a kialakításában játszott szerepet. Itt átadnám a kollégának a szót, aki magának az egész környezetnek
about the legal background of this whole environment and with the legal implications. As
A jogi megközelítések. Sokan sok mindent mondtak már a felhőről, és általában, ha jogi oldalról nézzük a dolgot, akkor általában az adatvédelmi jogi kérdések kerülnek elő, és itt merülnek.
come to grips with is data protection, because this raises the biggest problems. And let me highlight some of the aspects of this approach and outline a sort of approach that may help apply these things in in everyday life if you are going to use cloud services. Let me start with an international outlook. As you may have seen or may see from this list, this topic has been internationally well discussed, also the legal side of cloud usage, from the simplest data protection approaches upwards. Workgroup 29 has a described opinion about the utilization of clouds, but you find the same approach on the telecom side, in financial institutions, and also in IT security, where you find a lot of various approaches. You may note fundamental conflicts depending on whether clouds are considered from a European perspective or from the USA, where most of the service providers are situated. The problem being that there are two totally diagonally opposite approaches to what is considered to be private sphere and how it should be protected. Most of the data protection documents that have been mentioned before analyzed from a European standpoint all data protection issues and calls attention to the risks. There are fundamentally three such core components. First of all, it raises the concern about anybody using a cloud service needs use control over his data, because he has only restricted knowledge about the way the service provider handles his data, and even where these data are handled is unknown to the user. Also, access to these data is also a concern for most companies. Also, the cloud is considered as an area where the same protection must be provided as in non-cloud environments. The core component around which this whole thing is focused is the aspect of transparency. The service provider's operations and conditions must be transparent, or so the requirement goes. And when the user uses the service, it is actually a decision that involves confidence in the ISP, in the service provider. Now, how can the service provider make its services transparent, and how can it make using a cloud less risky from the point of view of the customer? The conflicts arise from the two possible approaches to the issue. The European community developed a solution method that would allow it to be to guarantee to get guarantees from U.S.-based service providers. This is incorporated in the safe harbor agreements. All U.S.-based companies may join this safe harbor agreement, guaranteeing that these participants comply with European standards. In Europe, the fact that a provider proves to be compliant with safe harbor provisions is not enough in itself. The service provider is expected to provide more. The U.S. approach says, if I have joined the safe harbor agreement, then this in itself proves that I comply with European legislation and allows me to provide services. The prison scandal, among others, threw the limelight on the concern that some service providers state that themselves that they comply with European requirements, and still data that they have stored in a cloud could be penetrated and accessed by unauthorized parties. Most people may not have noticed that the safe harbor agreement does include a provision that law may make exceptions, and all European legislations know about this, from the German through the British to the Hungarian. And it says that safe harbor agreements and data protection agreements may be overwritten by national security concerns. Obviously, it's a question in how much this corresponds to the Constitution and its provisions. If I provide cloud services for a major organization like a bank, that bank is in a sufficiently strong position to force the cloud provider to provide the services at specific conditions and protect itself against that provider's defaults. However, if I'm a natural person using a cloud service, I have by far less bargaining power, and I'll be forced to accept the service as is because it is free. And let me refer back to a presentation we heard this morning. This free service comes at a price because the price is our own private data that are being used and sold by the service provider. And we should find an equilibrium here between interests and the protection of and privacy protection and data protection. The possible solution would be to bring these two systems closer together, to harmonize, try to harmonize these two sets of requirements. The fears listed by the European approach should be dispelled by an atmosphere of trust. The question is whether this should be done by the legislator or by the parties themselves mutually regulated in contracts. In Hungary, surprisingly, there is one single piece of official declaration about utilization of cloud services, and it is a financial statement, and this has not yet been even accepted. The National Data Protection Authority has not issued any help about how they would inspect principles adhered to in the case of cloud services. We can only guess, and we can only guess because there are two general pieces of legislation that need to be applied. One is the information law on information, and maybe perhaps also the sector-specific legislation that may be in place, but these do not provide a good enough answer for the conditions the service provider should ensure and for protecting the data protection rights of the user. Obviously, the contracting parties are not necessarily at the same level in terms of bargaining force. So while it is said that the contract can provide the guarantees needed, it is still a question what legal solutions are available that are able to provide sufficient guarantees. In Hungary, it is also it is a problem that there is the law on information and the sectoral laws conflict because the new data protection law has been passed in 2011 in the frenzy of revolutionary legislation, and they simply forgot to adjust sectoral legislation to this new law. So the concept of data processor as an entity has been slapped on to the existing legislation later on. If I, as a data processor, tell the service provider to process these data, then the way this provider contracts other parties to achieve this, the question is whether I need to be involved in these contracts of the service provider with other parties. So the law has not clearly defined the legal foundations. Information security and data connection linkage is still at the level of the 80s, 1980s, 90s. So this law is not up to current requirements to be polite and is practically unusable for cloud services. The second set of problems is the issue of contracts. These contracts promise many things. Please take the trouble to read Google's general terms and conditions for cloud services. There are beautiful promises in there. However, you won't find any guarantee given to natural persons. I can even cite you an example. Sometimes Google does not provide such guarantees even to more heavyweight partners like a bank even. We should be able to find data protection provisions in these terms and conditions, and they should be added by Google out of its own free will. These are practically private agreements between the parties, and assume that the parties are equal as parties and have the same are in the same bargaining position, and accordingly their responsibilities can also be set in paper. I can only mention Google's example. They promise the world to you, but any responsibility is explicitly excluded. Google's responsibility is excluded. And if I, as a Hungarian private person, enter into a contract with a US-based service provider, then this legal relationship between us includes an international element, so international private laws for private persons should be applied.
ami alól hatodik szakad, ezeknek érvényesülni kell,
And this means that
szerződések
that certain private
az adatvédelmi jogok
law conditions must be met wherever the parties are.
alkalmazandó elemek közé tartozik, avagy sem.
So the question is whether data protection should also be included here. Well, after showing you the legal environment, let's get back to the situation. We have an attorney's office handling a lot of sensitive data during his daily work. So what requirements, what problems do you find in such an environment? A little in reflection to what my colleague just told you, in European and continental and British law, in continental law, data entry is already requires certain conditions to have been met, while in British law, requirements are mostly provided for the actual handling of data after they have been entered. The other thing is that in continental thinking, if a major organization provides services for a business or a private person, they are obviously not equal in bargaining position in power. So this in equilibrium should be reset to equal by legislation, but this has not yet been actually done yet, especially not in cloud services. Just two sentences about why we are citing this example of an attorney's office, apart from the fact that we ourselves are attorneys. We believe that the handling of data, personal data, is done not only by attorneys, but also in many other areas. So what we are discussing here should be important for also those parties that are not attorneys' offices and still handle private data. Without naming the service that we are currently using as an office, as an attorney's office, when we reviewed the tasks that needed to be solved, we found that we are not even competent to handle the introduction, the rolling out of the service at the office. We had to do a bit of learning before we could use the interfaces and we could evaluate and use the services we received. So when we talk about a sectoral cloud service with data, with the handling of private data, then these should be implemented without requiring users, mostly lay users, to have an understanding of the service they are using. At least they should not be required to have IT knowledge. However, while this user interface is being designed for a specific party, for us, like for instance, it is important to have some sort of IT knowledge to be able to specify the user interface that I'd like to see. Also, access rights to various parts of data, various types of data is general for all organizations. There are only three basic categories. I can access data and can change them. I can access them and only read them, or I can't access them at all. This requires documents to be broken down into these three areas, but I haven't seen any solution for that yet. Also, there are data contents that should be provided heavy protection. Data that is meant only for a specific attorney and not anybody else. So this type of data labeling or qualification is also an unsolved problem. All we see is information, data storage, and work organization, but not this type of of the confidentiality breakdown. Also, as we are not IT specialists, from time to time, we do need to to create physical backups, and not everybody has IT acquaintances. Well, actually, we managed to solve this. But for instance, restoring earlier data is still a problem, and the service itself, we haven't seen any service yet that extended to that would have provided a turnkey solution for encryption and key management. From the point of view of attorneys, it's also important to provide archiving and data preservation, and also the guarantees the service provider can give us. For instance, in the case of data migration, guarantees that our data will in fact be deleted from the area they used to be stored in. What is important is also the issue of authentication. Company registry data, for instance, need to be certified. We have yet to see a service provider that offers electronic archiving services in addition to cloud services. And there is a certification and data checking system that you see listed in the last row. It is destroyed in Hungary. It's also very incomplete. If I had to describe an ideal service for an attorney's office, then all the issues listed here should be incorporated as offerings, and should enable us to hire a new person to the attorney's office and have him working efficiently by the end of the day without having to go through a course.
Finally, as a conclusion, maybe come back for the paradigm of the lexic code. We think, and at least from a lawyer's point of view, this is a very clear example, that the system of coding that we use as legal experts and those which are at the basis of the IT systems, they can somehow compensate each other, and they're complementary to each other. And over the last 4 or 5 years, there have been plenty of initiatives from various working groups and research groups, which is identified by privacy design. Privacy design is not necessarily handling of classified information. It is basically a solution to comply with the data protection provisions in the basic area. From our point of view, this basically meant that we should comply with the requirements of the sector of the economy that is handling classified information, and that whereby we can also contribute to the protection of these data. And of course, for that purpose, some more product development will be necessary. Another basic requirement is on the part of the client, either a private person or a company, that there should be a thorough risk assessment before any kind of a contact is made with a service provider. What kind of data are processed? What are the processes that could be accelerated, facilitated, made more cost-efficient if this were done by cloud computing services? And what is the degree of risk-taking for the client once he will lose complete control over these data? Let it be a concrete loss complaint from the client, or if this could happen, what would be the negative impact on in the media on that? Now, Once this risk analysis has been completed, will have been completed, then one has to consider the conditions of the service providers on the market. We have to study thoroughly not only the various technical solutions, but also, if required, we should hire a legal expert to have a closer look at these various organizations or private persons who will handle these data, if they can provide sufficient guarantees in the contractually, or if we can, if one can modify or fine-tune these contractual obligations, and we can offer a checklist for that. Basically, what we have to consider, what are the data that we want that will be handled, what is the degree of protection for those data, what are the damages that can be caused to us, and compared to that, on the contractual basis, what is the responsibility, the liability taken by the service provider. And when it comes to a question of data handling, data processing, data control, how can we supervise and audit these processes? What are the solutions that are offered by the service provider for the protection of information? And if there should be any incident, to handle that incident, what is the information made available to us on those? And as my colleague just mentioned, what we have to look at basically is that whether the contract offers us sufficient data protection guarantees, whether these privacy by design elements are integrated into that contract, and that on that basis, it is on that basis that we can then conclude that that having examined all these matters, we can adopt a responsible decision, and that we can rely, that we can hand over these services, and we can, and that's how this mutual trust can be constructed, can be developed, because all this service provision is basically a matter of trust. Thank you for your attention and patience. If you have any questions, you can reach us at the email address at the end of our document lecture.